ancient era up to about 2000 BC, China had considerable isolation, but interacted a little with India and the Middle East. They were fertile and had irrigation systems, and although they did have advanced technology, they were still agriculturally based. They had advanced technology and an intellectual life, including horses, pottery, bronze, iron, and coal. They also had oracle bones to write on, which turned into ideographic symbols later in life. The Shang dynasty was established in the 1500 BCs, and they used horses, chariots, and metal weapons to become feared and fierce warriors. They were ruled by strong leaders who had help from their bureaucrats to run state and ritual occurrence. The bureaucracy was made up of aristocrats and previous rulers of the state. Ideographs became the basic form of writing, and writing on pen and paper, especially in calligraphy, became key to Chinese culture in the next. The Zhou dynasty was ruled with princes and kings, and they didn't have quite as much control over their vassals and nobles, which did lead them to becoming vulnerable and unstable. Their dependency on loyalties became a vulnerability, and they couldn't control their territory. The Huanghe to the Yangtze rivers became the Middle Kingdom, where wheat was grown in the north and rice was grown in the south. There was also the emergence of Confucius, which will inspire and influence China through the rest of its ages. It was established after the Zhou dynasty followed, and put in place was a brutal ruler named Shi Huangdi. This brutal ruler consolidated power and began construction of the Great Wall of China. This Great Wall led to deaths of laborers, brutal work, and injury, and overall, a resentment towards the new king. Innovations during this era included coinage, weights, measures, road planning, a uniform written script, irrigation projects, and the beginning of silk cloth. The decline was because the ruler was, let's say, not so beloved. And dynasty, as predicted after the Qin dynasty's follow, was considered the golden age in China. There was culture and intellectual flourishing, and although the power was still consolidated in the capital, the leader was a lot less brutal. Han Dynasty promoted Confucianism. Their decline became because of a loss of centralized power and an increase of nomadic invaders. And now into the post-classical era. Peace out, bye.
Start out with the Sui Dynasty. They exhausted the treasury, brought back the scholar gentries, built the Grand Canal. A lot of people died, but they made money, so it was a tie. The Tang Dynasty, into power they landed, took their territories, and expanded. Buddhism, what a schism. First there was Pure Land for the lower class folks, then there was Zen for the upper class blokes. By the end of the Tang, Buddhism was lame. They were looked down upon, to say the least. In fact, they were seen as some other type of beast. Confucianism emerged as Chinese ideology. It was hipper than anthropology. With the Jinshis and the Ministry of Rights, Chinese government was real tight. Cultural transfers with the Abbasids led to paper technology and less losses. Now we go to the Song Dynasty. Neo-Confucianism was their fantasy. They restricted women's rights and bound their feet up tight. The tribute system was put in place, making their military a sad case. The state sponsored commercial growth in infrastructure. There were also advancements in agriculture. The Grand Canal was quite the pal. Military garrisons, market quarters, banks, and paper money. These advancements weren't even funny. The Chinese weren't punks. They made junks. They also made textiles, porcelain, iron, and steel. Chinese cities became the real deal. Also, Champa rice was real nice.
And now on to the early modern.
Now we have to take a break from rapping because our time is lacking. So after the Song Dynasty, the Mongols invaded, including Genghis Khan, and they ruled China for about 400 years. And after that, the Ming Dynasty took over, becoming the first dynasty after 400 years.
Side note, Genghis Khan and his warriors were looked at as being very fierce and feared, and there's been a lot of considerable conflict about whether or not the Mongols should be looked at as brutal and even barbaric.
The Ming Dynasty had a very different ruling style than the Mongols. In fact, they wanted to get rid of all Mongol influence. They brought back the scholar gentries and renewed the Confucianism revived. The government also promoted commercial growth and economic growth, and they began trading with Europe, which gave them a big advantage. And in fact, they were in the position of power in this trade. Europe also brought over missionaries, and they tried to conquer China, but it was far too big. So instead, they tried to influence them through Christian missionaries. And China did not really accept this. They weren't really into the religion thing, but they did let the missionaries stick around so they could get knowledge from them. Example of this, Zhang He. He went on 7 naval voyages, and from 1405 to 1433, and he didn't have he found some interesting stuff like zebras, but nothing too extravagant, so China cut that off. Okay, so since China decided they didn't have to go out, they cut off their missions, they became isolationists.
All right, moving right along into the industrial era. So basically, Manchus from the north, who were previously the Han but are now the Manchus, invaded China and became the Qing dynasty. They ruled with cultural tolerance and implemented a calendar, but kept traditions including the bureaucracy and civil service exams. Women were still treated poorly, and the gap between upper and lower classes increased. But something surprising is as the influx of silver increased, merchants and artisans' statuses increased as well. The bureaucracy during this time was considered somewhat corrupted because high-ranking officials would save their spots for their sons or themselves even. Anyways, opium started coming to the Chinese civilians, which hit with devastating disaster, let me tell you. It led to addiction of the people and a fallout of the government and a fallout of social systems. Led to the Opium War, which Britain won, which was crazy because Britain has never won anything against the Chinese, which therefore let opium come into China unchecked, and China was forced to accept European ambassadors, which they've never had a subject of impression before, so this was just crazy. So what we're talking about here in China in this era, which was the industrial, was mostly internal conflicts. This included the Taiping Rebellion. This included the Taiping Rebellion, which sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a religious utopia. This then led to the self-strengthening movement, which reformed China to its traditional roots while still incorporating Western society. While this may seem progressive, the Boxer Rebellion still happened, which led to an increase of foreigners, even though it was posting an increase of foreigners, and also a greater control of China for Europeans. The Qing dynasty was replaced with a republic in 1912, and on we go to the contemporary.
After the dynasty fell and the republic took place, things were very chaotic in China and things were getting wild. People were mad. Groups and individuals opposed and promoted alternatives to existing government forms. An example of this is the Tiananmen Square protests in China,
which promoted democracy.
During World War II, China was invaded by Japan, and this was called the Rape of Nanking, and Chinese people were brutally attacked, and it was very brutal. Many people died. A very terrible time in China. After World War II, communism was spreading. One of these countries that became communist? China. You got it. The governments controlled their national economies, a lot of products, everything was controlled by the government, and an example of this is the Great Leap Forward. The father of communism in China was Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong.
At the end of the 20th century, Deng Xiaoping promoted free market economies and economic liberalization.